Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share tools and perspectives to equip leaders in self-development and team connection. I am your host, Natasha, and I am excited to share today's episode with you. Our episode today is a conversation with U.S. Army Command Sergeant Major David Astorga on developing others, being authentic, building trust, and holding yourself accountable as a leader.
Thank you so much for joining me. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us your style of leadership?
Yes, well, guten Morgen or good morning from Germany, Natasha and fellow leaders. My name is David Astorga. I am originally from Southern California, Boyle Heights, California to be exact. Happily married to my wife of 22 years, Iris. We have 3 beautiful children, 2 currently serving on active duty with the Air Force, one's in Japan and Kuwait, respectively. And our youngest, Nayeli, is living with us here in beautiful but currently cold Wiesbaden, Germany. I too am on active duty with the Army, and I have been serving our armed forces for over 23 years. I currently serve as the U.S. Army Europe and Africa Provost Sergeant Major, and also have over 15 years of experience as a special agent with the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division. As for my style of leadership, I like to share my 3 I ams to help describe that. This is something that I have used since graduating the Sergeant Major's course, and I acquired it from one of the guest speakers we had there. And bottom line, the guest speaker just had us fill in the blank. He said, I am, and then fill in the blank. He encouraged us when we get back out to the field, he encouraged us to ask our soldiers for their I ams. But before I did that, I wanted to make sure I knew what my I ams were, and so I figured, well, let me jot down my I ams. My first I am is that I am a follower of Jesus. Now, I don't say that to turn anyone off or to make people think that I'm holier than thou, because I'm not. I can assure you, I continue to make mistakes. I will continue to make mistakes. You can just ask my wife or my kids and they will tell you, yeah, no, he's certainly not perfect. I more so share that because I want them to hold me accountable to that style of leadership. For me, when I think of doctrinally, right, the Army defines leadership as a process of influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation in order to improve the organization and accomplish the mission. So that's the doctrinal term of leadership. The key word I hone in on there is influence. So I go around, and when I'm talking to soldiers, junior soldiers, I'll ask them, or just really anyone, how do you influence? And if you've never been asked that question and you don't think you influence, I would beg to differ and say that you do. Whether you know it or not, right, wrong, or indifferent, you are influencing the people around you. I share a story about my son. He prays before he eats. So that's just natural for them to pray before they eat. Well, there was a fellow airman who had seen him do this at the dining facility every day. And after a couple of weeks, that airman told my son, he's like, you know what? I like that you do that consistently. I'm gonna start doing that. My son never knew like people were watching him, and I use that as an example for the audience that you do influence one way or another. You people are watching, whether you think so or not. And so sticking to that word, when I think about, if you don't know how you influence, then I would ask you the second question, which is, who influences you? Because I feel like you will probably find a connection to how you potentially influence others. Because whoever it is that you gravitate towards, or you like something about their style of leadership, you may find that you actually have some of those attributes yourself and you just don't know it. But there's something that leads you towards that leader. And so for me, the biggest influencer in my life, no secret, is Jesus. And when I think about this man who, for me, he's a God man, but if we can acknowledge that he was a historical figure, if you consider his life and you look at, his ministry, his teaching lasted about 3 to 4 years. He didn't travel more than 100 miles from where he was born. And 2,000 plus years later, he still has a following of over 2.2 billion people. If you just want to consider him a man, that's fine. A man in history. Wouldn't you be a little curious or just want to know, what is it about his style of leadership that continues to have this enduring impact on people's lives? So My first I am, that's why I share that first I am. And so going back to accountability, I share that first one more so to ask that you hold me accountable as a leader in your organization or in the community. And if you don't see me displaying love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, I lack it a lot of times, unfortunately. If you don't see me displaying those consistently, I genuinely want to know, and I would ask that you hold me accountable. My second I am is that I am a professional servant, and that probably gave away my leadership style. The first time I heard the term servant leadership or servant leader was at a change of command. I remember thinking of that term, and I said, wow, it was very impactful, because when you take those two words, servant and leader, and you separate them, they're so distinct. Servant, you think kind of beneath or below, or you're serving, and leader has a little bit more prestige, I guess. You're leading, you're definitely above something. But when you bring those two words together, to me, they just make so much sense. I honestly feel that I've been entrusted as a leader in order to be intentional about developing the people around me, the subordinates that I'm responsible for. And I know that general wasn't the one who coined the term. It was actually, I believe it was Robert Greenleaf who actually coined the term servant leaders. My last throw a fun one in there. I am a Dallas Cowboy fan, so you probably just lost a couple of audience members, but it's just the truth. All that to say that, those three I ams hopefully gave you a sense of more or less my style of leadership. And for me, who we are determines how we act. And you could also flip that around, how we act determines who we are. Bottom line, my style of leadership is servant leadership style. At least that's what I try to project.
Well, the first thing I love is using the I am statements. I think a lot of times people come at things to demonstrate credibility, and they do it in a way that's like them reading their resume. And that doesn't really tell us anything, right? It doesn't tell us how they want feedback, how they're going to engage with us. But using I am statements is just so much more impactful, because you're telling more of a story versus just reading a list of qualities that may or may not mean something to people. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I think it goes to that one of the earlier points you made about influence, who influences you, and that whole piece too, because how do I want to show up? Especially in leadership, we need to let all of that stuff fall away and just show people like, this is how I'm going to show up for you and care for you. If I'm not demonstrating those things, I'm also open enough and humble enough and have not so much ego that I can accept that information.
Absolutely. And words are who you pretend you want to be. Actions are who you are. And so someone can come across and say, I'm a servant leader through words, but if their actions don't display that, then you're more a pretender than an actual doer. I feel like servant leadership sincerely has to have a genuine and engaged style. You have to be willing to, like you mentioned earlier, almost share a little bit about your heart to start to build that trust with your teammates, right? If you're very just kind of stoic or just checking the block, hey, how are you? And you're not really getting to know someone, I think it takes a little bit longer to build that trust, whereas I look to apply the personal power over the positional power. The personal power is the one that has, at least for me, helped me be successful, because they know that it's coming from a genuine heart, I hope anyways, as I get to know them. A story I'll share is I had an NCO at my last unit. He was married, blended family. When I was getting to know him on a TDY trip, we were driving, and he started to share about his wife and his kids, how they met. He had an anniversary in August. Well, when I got to the hotel, I ended up just pulling up my phone, got his contact, and just quick little notes. I remembered the names of the kids and his wife. And I just got it down in my notes. When we had a function a couple of months later, and I remember he was going to be there and his family was going to be there. And so I pulled up my notes that I had for him, kind of like a little digital leader's book, and went through that, entered, met him, saw his family, and I said, hi, you must be so-and-so. And you must be the oldest son because you're the tallest and you've got a little spirit in you. Your dad told me about you, so you must be, you know. And I asked the spouse, what are you guys doing for your anniversary? I know it's coming up soon, right? And if you were to see their facial expressions, I think that the spouse was just in awe. I was intentional about doing that. So I think there's sincerity when you do that. And I'm not saying you're going to be able to do that for all your people, but your inner core, the people that you work with daily and more consistently with, I think those are the folks that you can have the biggest impact with by actionable things like that.
I love that story so much because there's that aspect of really listening to what people are saying, which is such an important skill for everyone to have, but especially leaders. But I also really liked when you talked about the trust aspect, because Charles Feltman, he wrote a book called The Thin Book of Trust. And in it, he talks about we're building trust in these 4 domains all the time. So every time we interact, it's not that there's no neutrality in trust building. It's adding to or it's taking away. So we just need to be very aware. So the 4 distinctions he makes are when we're talking with someone and we're assessing trust, we're assessing do they care? We're assessing how sincere they are. We're assessing their reliability. And then we're also assessing their competence. And so with that, trust is not just an on-off switch. Instead, we're really building it in these different areas. And what I appreciate about your story there is that you demonstrated trust in all of those areas, not only by listening in the moment, taking notes, and I love the intentionality that you brought up, because you're right, we're all so busy. And I know from one minute to the next, if I don't write something down, it's gone forever. That's never coming back. So just the intentionality that you had in writing that down really demonstrated, I think, all 4 of those distinctions, so that then when that opportunity to engage again, it was sincere, right? Because you were sincerely interested, you took the time to write it down, and then took the time to engage again on those things.
Yeah, thank you. It's one of my favorites. I share it often. I think good leaders share stories. That's actually, again, in one of the books that I'm reading.
So in your leadership journey, which I know you've had many different amazing experiences, but kind of back at the beginning of it, was there an event or a person or a moment that really helped you step into the role of a leader?
2 things come to mind. If I were to consider a specific event that empowered me to identify myself as a leader, early leader, I would probably have to go back to my, in my early teens when I was part of the Naval Sea Cadet Corps program. As a cadet with the program, I was often given a lot of responsibilities and put in charge of fellow cadets. I think in that season, I started to see that I could maybe do this. It was a little uncomfortable. People kept trusting me to lead the platoon that we had. Also during this same season, my parents were also in the process of divorce. And with me being the oldest sibling, I took on additional responsibilities at home, helping my mom with my 2 younger siblings. So if I were to kind of pinpoint an area where I kind of started to see that there was potential there, like in myself to possibly lead, I would say that was the time frame. Character, I talk about character too. Character is the essence of who we are. And that character is shaped from your family. It starts with your family, right? Those family dynamics, those attributes, those traits that are instilled in you from your family upbringing. And then for me, joining the service, the Army takes that character and begins to mold it, adding a big flavor of leadership. I'm very thankful for the experiences I had growing up, and also obviously more so thankful for what the Army has done in molding me through the different professional development schools that they've sent me, because I continuously learn. I mentioned earlier my job as a CID special agent. You may not believe it, but I was actually I consider myself still introvert, but a lot of folks in my coworkers would say, no, you're not introverted, you talk a lot. As a matter of fact, at West Point, I had a soldier kindly tell me, Sergeant Major, you like to talk, don't you? I was like, oh, I didn't think so, but no, not in a bad way. I think when you speak, you have, nice things to say, and it's encouraging. But, that really kind of think like, okay, I guess I do like to talk. When I started out in the Army, I was very quiet, joining the service. During basic, you would not be able to spot me. As a matter of fact, they have like leadership positions. Everyone has to go be like the squad leader or the team leader. They give you a little brassard with couple stripes. Well, normally it was about a 3 to 4 day time frame that everyone got to. If I remember correctly, I lasted like 2 weeks, and a drill sergeant said, "Hey," finally realized that I had been doing it for 2 weeks because I was just so quiet, and I got fired, but that was funny. But again, I'm very quiet, very introverted. But I feel like my job in law enforcement certainly got me out of my own way, got me out of my shell, because as an investigator, as a special agent, you're very much forced into getting, number one, people comfortable with you and talking to you and sharing some very, deep things that perhaps, they experienced or want to get off their chest. So I feel, again, those skill sets, the things that my trade, my job that the Army's given me to perform, those things have certainly molded me and my character to what you currently see now. And so it's really helped me become comfortable in uncomfortable situations. Going back, I remember being asked for the first time as a brand new sergeant major to be a guest speaker. And I'm thinking like, oh man, that seems like a big responsibility. And I don't want to just be up there just to talk and hear myself. I really hope I come up with something to share. So what do I say? What do I share with these up and coming staff sergeants? And so I remember I just pulled out a notebook on my way to Fort Leonard Wood on the plane, and I just started jotting down what would I want to know as a brand new or up and coming a sergeant becoming a staff sergeant. One of the first things I wrote is mature leaders have elasticity and can stretch themselves in complex environments or situations, kind of like a rubber band. I normally have a rubber band. For me, it's a reminder to stretch myself in whatever environment or situation or the people that I'm interacting with, because we're all different. What works with one person may not work with another. I'm not a yeller, like I said earlier, but there are some folks that if you just yell at them once, they've never seen that side of you come out, they're fixed. But then you have another person, another soldier who may not respond to that. That next person may respond to a good, detailed counseling. Okay, they care about their report card, their rating, right? But then you may have that third person who doesn't respond to either of those. That third person may respond to just a genuine and engaged conversation. Is there something going on in your life that perhaps I'm not aware of that you wouldn't mind sharing with me, just so that I know, or maybe give you some space or some time off for you to deal with whatever it is you have going on? That's the engagement I'm talking about. That's the sincerity and the genuineness that I think comes with being a servant leader and being able to identify those moments or those soldiers dealing with things. But a lot of times, unfortunately, often leaders will just jump on someone, not realizing that there's other things behind the curtain that they're dealing with that perhaps they haven't shared with that leader because that leader hasn't taken the time to build that trust with them.
Annually, Gallup, they do a poll about lack of engagement in the workplace. And they find that people are disengaged about 60% of their day. And as they try to look into why that is, a lot of times it's because they're like, even if I talk, no one's going to listen. Even if I have ideas, people don't care. If there's something going on with me, leadership doesn't have any interest in it. I love the rubber band thing, because as a leader, being able to, there's where we're comfortable, right? So maybe that's where there's a pin in that rubber band. But because in a leadership position, people need different things. If it's close to where that rubber band is pinned in, it's going to come more naturally to us, but we have to be willing to stretch and get into those uncomfortable zones so that we can really create that environment of psychological safety where people can engage with us, but also where we know what other people need from us to help with any extrinsic motivation, right? I mean, most motivation is internal, but if there are ways that we can motivate or empower people to be able to find those places and understand those that we lead.
Absolutely.
So you've given us some amazing stories already and some stuff about your leadership journey. What else has kind of occurred along your leader development story that has made you who you are today as a leader?
I think you mentioned it earlier. I try to be humble, so humility. I'll go over briefly as my leadership principles. So one of the things with my IAMs, going back to that, I have 2 simple slides that goes with me, and I pretty much memorized most of them. And I took these slides from a previous commander that I had. And what I loved about this individual is his willingness to right off the bat, as a brand new commander, share who he was. I thought, man, that's amazing. I need to acquire that. So coming out of the academy, armed with a lot of goodies from a bunch of awesome guest speakers, I just developed these 2 slides. And so the second slide is my leadership principles. So I mentioned earlier a little bit about the 2 types of power, personal approach versus the positional power approach. And I think that that's where just one person, one leader can have a huge impact in the new organization and the climate that they come into. There's a difference between climate and culture. A lot of times leaders want to come in and change the culture, but culture takes years and possibly decades to change, right? The Army has a culture. Units have a certain type of culture. You're not going to get at that culture until you start chipping away at the climate. And it starts at the climate level. One person can surely make an impact in whatever environment they go into by starting at the climate. So for me, in my journey, coming out of the academy, going to my first assignment there at West Point, I had security guards. One of the things that my director at the time had asked me to focus my leadership on was the morale of the security guards. Wasn't where it probably needed to be. So I remember thinking, okay, well, how do I do that? What I did was take the time for 7 days to go to their guard mount. The guard mount is 30 minutes before they get on shift. There's some kind of class or training. So I went to their guard mount every day at 5:30 in the morning, 1:30 p.m., and then again at 9:30 p.m. At every shift change, I was going simply just to introduce myself, just to say, hey team, I'm your new DES Sergeant Major. How can I be a voice for you? I'm not gonna make any empty promises and say, hey, I'm gonna fix everything, but how can I start building that relationship with you? What can I help you with? What are some concerns or just things that I can assist with from my seat? And after a week of that, my boss, a couple of weeks later, says, hey, Sergeant Major, what did you do with the guards? They're singing your praises. So, sir, I didn't do anything. I just went and introduced myself. Like, what? That's it? I said, yeah, I just went and introduced myself. And some of the feedback that I did get is like, that was the first time they had ever seen a green suiter higher than a staff sergeant just go and say hello to them. It's really the little things that make the biggest impact on people. It's adding that human flavor, that human dynamic to leadership, which I think not just the Army, I think all organizations, many organizations, not all, lack that human flavor to leadership.
Just that simple act of saying hello. I know that when I was at West Point, for the first time, a new Sergeant Major had come in, and like within his first week, he also went around. I was not someone who was in his quote unquote lane at all, but he knew that we could both help each other. I just love that approach of how can we support each other? How can I be, you said it as, how can I be a voice for you? But that's the other thing I think that people forget when they're in positions of leadership, where they're so worried about like all these different things that you have to do as a leader, that one of your most important things is to understand what is interfering with people doing their job and removing those blockages, but then also that like human side of it. And when you said one person can have an impact, I completely agree. And there is a podcast called Work Check, and recently they were having this debate, like, is there such a thing as company culture or even company climate? And they do a point counterpoint, which is a lot of fun. But one of the people said, I don't think there's any such thing as company culture, because when one person comes in, they're working with their team, and just those team dynamics are what shapes it. But then you go to a different team within the same company and it's completely different. This whole idea of organizational culture is a myth. Now, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that, but I do appreciate that you have no idea, especially when you're the leader, when you come in, you have that positional power or influence. I don't even want to say influence, but that position that kind of gets you started, and then how you use that to help people is ultimately, what makes the team effective. I don't even want to say what makes the team like the leader, but it's what makes the team effective. And kind of going back to the servant leader thing, it's that, like, if you look at like a pyramid or a hierarchy, like, yeah, that thing at the top can't sit there without all those things, at the base and at the foundations.
I love that you reminded me of something that actually I had forgotten that I've said in the past. I love your pyramid picture, because I feel like servant leaders take that pyramid picture and flip it, and that leader at the top is now here at the bottom serving all those. So that's a visual that I get when I think of that pyramid. I try to encourage leaders, hey, if you're trying to project that style, take that triangle and just flip it upside down. And that's really true leadership. Servant leadership also, you got to be willing to be humble to serve, right? Some folks, it's just not in them, and that's okay. There's different styles. I'm not saying servant leadership is the way, it's just a way. At least for me personally, I have found that this style of leadership is truly what's helped me be who I am and helped me get to where I'm at today. It's built a lot of relationships. I call it my 3 R's. Relationships lead to resources, which lead to results. Again, adding that human flavor. So I don't want to be asking, I think you mentioned about the whole networking, right? Like, hey, how can we help each other? I don't want to be asking the sergeant major or the first sergeant at an installation when I absolutely need it, like, oh, I need it like really quick. And oh, by the way, that's the first time I'm meeting you. Oh, by the way, I'm the new DES sergeant major. That's probably not going to help your case a whole lot. They may not be as willing to help you as opposed to had you met them well before when you first got to a new location, a new organization, and introduce yourself to the team and just going outside your comfort zone, right? Again, being comfortable in uncomfortable situations and throwing yourself out there like, hey, I'm so-and-so, wanted to see how I can help, or this is what I do, if I could ever assist you. That's where I kind of develop my 3 R's, relationships lead to resources, which leads to results. And so with that, one of my leadership principles off my list is avoid I've made it thinking. There's certainly wisdom and humility. So do I think that I've made it simply because I'm a sergeant major in the United States Army? No. I can certainly learn from the most junior private and newest person in the organization. Just in conversation with them, they may share something, they may share a resource that they used during a difficult time in their life that I was not aware of. Now I'm aware of this resource. I now PCS, I go to my new location. Perhaps there's a soldier there dealing with a similar situation. I'm like, hey, have you ever considered this resource? So again, you have to avoid I've made it thinking. Don't ever think you've made it. As cliche as it may sound, the day you think you've made it at anything, you stop learning. We should strive to be lifelong learners.
Absolutely. When you stagnate there, not only are you not learning more for yourself, I have seen people who have this mindset of I've made it, who then think that anybody junior to them needs to go through what they went through and struggle the way that they struggled, when in reality, you've made it to this point. And I always think, especially in leadership, like now the harder work begins because you're helping to pull people up. You're making sure that the people ahead of you are, also have the information and the resources. And sometimes you're grabbing your peers and kind of pushing everybody along. So if people can stay out of that, I've made it. It's really just that I got to this point. It was a lot of hard work and I should take a moment to be proud, but also more hard work is required.
Absolutely. Being deliberate about developing the people around you, the subordinates, and even your peers, if they're willing to listen.
Oftentimes we get into these leadership positions and it becomes so much about others that our development either stagnates or it's just creeping along. In your opinion, how can leaders approach their self-development throughout their career?
And I struggle with that question because I think I have found myself in that situation, maybe even currently now. And I was actually just talking to a soldier last night. They graduated air assault school. And it's something that I'm like, well, I haven't gone to air assault school. I've seen other peers of mine go to air assault school and be successful. Why don't I sign up for the next iteration? If I'm being honest, part of that's just a little fear of like not making it through and completing. Also, I think just comfort. If I'm being fully transparent, we as leaders can get very comfortable in just status quo of like, well, this is just what I do. I'm going to develop others and just, it's all about them. But you're right. I think there certainly has to be a balance and maybe a little bit of selfishness in taking care of yourself as well and continuing to develop yourself. One of the things that I recently finally accomplished, completed my bachelor's degree, but it took me all of 22 years and it was just chipping away at it. if I'm being honest with myself, I think the excuse I kept telling myself is like, well, I'm too busy taking care of this or doing that and family and distractions. When in reality, I was just comfortable in my schedule. Like if I added school, it would make me uncomfortable. And now I got to add more work on myself. So I would just encourage leaders to be willing to get out of that comfort zone and take a shot.
You mentioned that sometimes there's a little bit of selfishness that's required, but that selfishness, I would say, to just kind of reframe it a little bit, like you need that. You're never going to be able to be a good leader if you're not continuing to learn and continuing to develop. But I think we can view it as like seasons, where this season I've got time for that and I can be a little more selfish with my time so that I'm ultimately not pouring from an empty cup.
No, you're absolutely right. And I love that you said seasons, because I currently find myself in a season of development in my style of leadership. Going back to my I ams, those I ams, that first one has evolved. And it's lately more so here. I have found myself more willing to be a little bit more bold.
What leadership advice would you offer a leader in any organization?
One of the things I find myself sharing or encouraging folks is to certainly find yourself a mentor and be intentional about letting that person know that you consider them a mentor. A lot of times I think you have folks who say, oh yeah, no, I mentored so-and-so. But in reality, you're like, I really know you didn't. Or you did, but not in the way that you think you did. I'm not going to do things how you did. In my opinion, the mentor doesn't pick the mentee picks the mentor. So I encourage my peers and leaders and supporters and just people around me, find yourself a good mentor and be intentional about letting them know that that's what you consider them. And hopefully the good ones, the good mentors will take ownership of that and read. I don't read a whole lot, but I have been trying to find those like just baby steps, right? So I've recently found that 30-second servant blog. And so it takes 30 seconds to a minute, 2 minutes to read. I highly encourage you to check out Permission to Speak Freely by Matt Kincaid and Doug Crandall. There's a lot of richness in there as far as development. In the very beginning, they share a story about how an approach that you can potentially use when having to have a difficult conversation with somebody is a three-phase approach. So you start with grace. Remember correctly, you start with grace. Second part of that is be willing to share some of your own vulnerabilities. And then the third part of that, once you've praised them, given them grace, and then you've shared some of your inadequacies perhaps or vulnerabilities. Third part of that is to ask for permission to, hey, do you mind if I share with you an observation? Don't come at them accusatory and say, hey, you come across like this. Hey, may I share an observation? And I find that approach keeps those walls down, because when you come at someone accusatory, walls are going to go up immediately, and then they're just going to be on defense mode. Find those good books. You have an awesome reading list. I've pulled some of those from there. And then lastly, I would just say, find the fellow leaders or peers or just people that would be willing to be vulnerable with you, compassionate, and authentic. Because I find that when you surround yourself with compassionate, vulnerable, and authentic people, as the book of Proverbs says in 27:17, iron sharpens iron as one person sharpens another. So I love those iron sharpening sessions to continue to develop yourself as a leader.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been absolutely amazing. Yeah, so much good stuff in here. I'm really excited.
I hope that somebody could take even one thing out of this interview. And I just thank you for this opportunity. It's always humbling to be asked to do something like this.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Equipping Leaders podcast. For more leadership development content, you can visit my website, natashacheyenne.com, where you will find my leadership journal with dozens of articles, and the Cultivation Cafe, which is always growing and has leadership frameworks, book recommendations, and inclusion and mental health resources. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha or at Equipping Leaders Podcast, and on Twitter at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.